everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Jetta Whittaker, Manager of the Policy and Program Development Unit within the Division of Senior and Disabilities Services, or SDS, which is a division within the Department of Health. For those of you who cannot see me, I'm a Caucasian woman with rapidly graying curly hair. The role of the Policy and Program Development Unit, among its many other duties, is to manage the process of amending regulations that provide structure and guidance for SDS programs. The rate rebasing regulations before us today use the process that is laid out in existing regulations to develop new payment rates. These proposed rebasing regulations are now available and out for public comment. They do two main things. They update the three rate charts that are adopted by reference, addressing long-term services and supports, and they propose changes to the instructions and methodologies that are used when calculating the payment rates. This audiovisual FAQ examines how the payment rates are rebased or adjusted for the following services: home and community-based waiver services, personal care services, community first choice services, and long-term services and supports targeted case management. You can find out more about how and when to submit your comments and questions about these proposed regulations by visiting the online public notice system or SDS's proposed regulations page, which I'm going to show you how to get to by sharing my screen. And then I'm going to pull it from here. This is the Senior and Disabilities Services main web page. On the right-hand navigation bar, if you scroll down to the bottom of this gray rectangle under Of Interest, you will see one more space, SDS regulations and related material. That brings you to the regulations page of current regulations, in development regulations, and proposed regulations. By clicking on the link on the left, it will bring you to the proposed regulations page where the content of this regulations package will be placed. And now I'm going to stop presenting and come back here and say, while SDS is handling the process of amending the payment regulations, the Office of Rate Review within the Commissioner's Office is responsible for calculating those payment rates. Kate McDonald with the Office of Rate Review will now walk you through the methodologies used by showing examples of how current rates are adjusted to become the proposed rates in this rate package. Kate?
Thank you, Jetta. My name is Kate McDonald. I am an auditor with the Office of Rate Review. I am a Caucasian woman in my mid-30s with medium length brown hair. I've been with the office for about 12 years, and I'm going to walk you guys through the document that is included in the public notice. It's not an adopted by reference. It's an informational document that shows how we have set the rates for the three charts that Jetta described earlier. What you'll see on your screen currently is that rate calculation file. It is a 43-page document. I'm currently at the table of contents on page 1. What you will see is the first header talks about something called a target cost-based methodology. There are really two different ways to set rates. One is looking at historical costs and inflating it forward to the future time period. A second one is a modeled methodology. Both methodologies are utilized for calculating all of the subsets. Some services are set by cost and some are set by a model, and I'll walk through those. So first you'll see under the target provider methodology, the list of services that are set utilizing that methodology. At a high level, each August 1, the department puts forth a list of the largest 5 providers for each of the service categories listed under that target methodology. Those providers make up about a universe of 30 to 35 providers, and those providers have to submit cost reports and audited financial statements for the particular fiscal year that is then looked at by the auditors in the Office of Rate Review and utilized using the methodology document that is adopted by reference and regs to set the rates. So even though the largest 5 providers submit reports, a provider will report costs for their entire book of business. So a provider who might have been a top 5 provider for group home, if they also do respite, all of their costs for respite are also reported. So what you really have is more than 5 providers costs for a particular service. For the services that are listed under the target methodology, we generally have anywhere from 60 to 100% of the units of service represented for what's billed to Medicaid. If I scroll down, you'll see the next uh, major bullet is related to a model methodology. Under there, you will see the 4 different services that are not encompassed within the cost-based methodology. Those providers, if you took the largest 5 providers of the units of service for them, which was selected to limit the administrative burden on providers instead of having all providers have to submit cost reports and detailed audited financial information. These providers wouldn't make up a substantial chunk of the units of service for Medicaid and wouldn't be representative for rate setting. So instead, these rates are set using a modeled methodology. What that means is we utilize components such as wages building from the ground up to calculate what the rate would be using publicly available information. So those services are care coordination, the skills building for community first choice, residential supported living, and transportation. So we'll walk you through first the target methodology. A few services. A lot of the services are calculated in the same way, so I'm not going to walk through the entire 43-page document. I'll talk about a singular regular calculation, and then there's certain ones that we have to do something special with, and I'll explain various categories for those. And then we'll touch on the modeled methodologies and how we calculate those. So for our first target methodology one, let's look at a regular calculation. So we're going to go to Chore. So you can click within the document, you can click on the table of contents Chore, and it will bring you to the page where Chore is calculated. The first page, so that is page 4 of 43, shows you the step-by-step process. I'm actually going to slide down to the second page for Chore, which is page 5 of 43. And this is the detailed information by provider. So you'll see a table that has one column being provider with provider A, B, C. Then it lists the provider's chore costs and the chore units of service. Important things to note. One for the costs, the second column. These are costs from the provider. From after their desk review. So if any adjustments needed to be made by the ORR auditors, they were made. The costs are then go through a step process that is spelled out in the adopted by reference methodology document. For example, costs are geographically neutralized if based on the geo differentials that are listed on the charts. Next, overhead costs, like the administrative costs, are allocated to each cost center. And by cost center, I mean, chore, respite, each of the services based on how it's spelled out in the methodology document. Then those costs are inflated forward to the midpoint of the time period of the proposed rate chart. Finally, one of the components of the model includes increasing providers' costs by 5% for what's called the access factor. And that makes sure that these large providers who have economies of scale that we've accounted for that and make the rate accessible to even small providers. So 5% has been added. So what you see in column 2 is the end result for each provider, specifically for Chore, of the process spelled out in regulations. The third column, units of service, is the units of service reported on the revenue and statistics worksheet, and it is total units of service, all payers. Why that's important is the costs represent costs for the entire organization. Therefore, the units, which are on the denominator of the calculation, also need to reflect all services provided and not just Medicaid. So what you can see here is for each provider, their specific costs and units. At the very bottom, you'll see the sum total. So you'll see about 615,000 in costs for Chore and roughly 92,000 in units of service. This information will flow into what you see on page 4 of 43 that I'm going to scroll back up to. So to do a regular calculation, we utilize the provider's data that's all aggregated together. So you can see here in step 1, we take total costs as the numerator, divided by total of units of service as the denominator, and have a raw reimbursement rate of $6.65. In step 2, we determine what the benchmark rate is. In regulations, the benchmark rate is the rate in the state fiscal year that precedes the rate calculation. So in this case, state fiscal year 22. So the rate was 719 during the time period. What occurs next is we calculate what 5% reduction from that benchmark and a 5% increase is. The reason is in the methodology document, one of the components of the rate setting is something that is called a stop loss factor. When this methodology document was being drafted originally back in 2016 and 17 through provider work groups with the department, one of the main components that providers really wanted to see is in addition to lessening the administrative burden on all providers who were required to report at that time was predictability. And so a stop loss factor was added where it basically says during rebasing, the rates will increase or decrease by no more than 5%. This is in reaction to a prior regulation that had much wider swings. And so you can see here we calculate what 95% of that benchmark rate is and what 105% of that benchmark rate is. In step 4, what we do is we compare that raw Medicaid reimbursement rate that we calculated in step 1, and we compare it to that -5 and +5 benchmarks. Which rate moves on depends on a three-pronged test. First, you look at that raw Medicaid rate, in this case, 665. You see if it is below the 5% reduction, which is $6.83. In this case, for Chore, it is. So what we move forward with is we move forward with the $6.83, the 95% benchmark rate. That way, the rate will go down by no more than 5%. If the raw Medicaid rate set calculating the provider's costs fell in between the 95% and the 105% benchmark rate, the rate set using the provider's costs would be what moves forward. That's the second option. Option number 3 is if the raw Medicaid rate set using the provider's cost is higher than the 105% benchmark rate, the 105% benchmark rate would be what moves on. So you look at those three-prong tests. In this case, the raw Medicaid rate using providers' costs is less than 5%, is smaller than the 5% reduction, and so we move forward with the 5% reduction instead of going at a larger reduction. So you can see at the bottom of step 4, it shows the result is the 95% benchmark rate, and it shows what that rate is, the $6.83. Generally, for most rebasing, we would be done. However, this year, there is a special component we have to take account for. That is the fact that in House Bill 281, the legislature approved through appropriations an increase in 10% to the rates that we're talking about here related to increasing wages for direct service staff. So the cost that we're utilizing was prior to that time, so we want to make sure we increase by 10% that pre-legislative appropriation rate to make sure we align with the legislative intent. So that's what you see when we do the $6.83, increasing it by 10% to get the $7.51. That final proposed rate of $7.51 is what you will see on the rate chart for Chore services. I'm going to scroll back up now to the table of contents. On the table of contents under the target provider cost methodology, most services go through that exact same process that I just walked with you through with Chore services. Some services have what we call a special calculation. You'll see that on the table of contents document, where after we list the service and the service code, we will have in parentheses special calculation. So for example, adult daycare is one of those. There are really 4 main categories of special calculations. So you'll see adult daycare and respite are one particular category. What that category is we have a singular pool of costs where the providers report their rather adult daycare or respite costs, but we need to set two rates with varying units of service with it. So for example, the adult daycare has a 15-minute rate and it has a half day rate, which is a 1 to 4 hour unit of service. The cost that the providers reported encompasses both costs. And so therefore, we have to do a special calculation because we have to take that singular pool of costs and divide it to be able to set two separate rates while making sure we utilize the entire amount of costs from the providers. So I'm going to click on the adult daycare link and show you that calculation. So now I'm at the top of page 2 of 43. If I would scroll down to 3 of 43, you'll see it has that same summary like you had with Chore, where it shows for each provider what their costs were at the end of the process, where we allocated overhead, inflated, did the access factor. And you'll see now two columns for units of service. You'll see the 15-minute unit of service and the half day. So you'll see providers who offer often both units of service. At the bottom of that chart, you'll see roughly 1.9 million in costs and 87,000 units of service that are the 15-minute, and between 15 and 16,000 units of service for the half-day unit. So scrolling back up to the top of page 2, let's walk through how we do it with this one. With this one, we talked about with Chore how there is the stop loss factor where rates were to increase or decrease by no more than 5%. In the case of these special calculations, that stop loss factor is not applied on the individual rate level because we might want the proportion between the two things to change greater than that, but we don't want the entire expenditures on an aggregate level to go beyond the plus or minus 5%. So therefore, when you see this stop loss, it's being applied on the aggregate level, and you'll see that happening in the first two steps. So in step 1, we list the two codes. We list what their benchmark rate was from the prior state fiscal year 22. We list what the target provider methodology units were for those, and we calculate benchmark costs both for the 15-minute unit and the half day unit and add them together. So the benchmark costs are roughly 1.9 million. We then calculate the aggregate stop loss by doing plus 5% and minus 5% from those benchmark costs. So the plus 5% is close to $2 million. The minus 5% or 95% benchmark is close to 1.8 million. In step 3, we look at the provider's aggregated costs from that table back on the bottom of page 3 of 43. The costs are roughly 1.9 million. In step 4, we do a similar 3-pronged test that we did with Chore, where we look at the provider's aggregated costs in comparison to the aggregate plus or minus 5% benchmark. So again, how this is we look at the provider's costs, roughly 1.9 million, and first we say, is that 1.9 million below the 1.8 million? No. If it was, what we would move forward with is the 1.8 million, but it is not. So next we say, is that 1.9 million in between the two plus or minus 5%? It is, because the 1.9 million is between 1.8 and roughly 2 million. So what you'll see in step 4 is we do move forward with the provider's cost of the 1.9 million. The third prong of that test was if the provider's cost was greater than the benchmark costs of plus 5%, we would move forward with just that plus 5%. In this case, it is not, because the 1.9 million is less than the 2 million. So in step 4, we had determined we move forward with the provider's cost of 1.9 million. That's the numerator of the calculation. Now we have to get to the denominator of the calculation. In step 5, we need to make sure the denominator of the calculation is in the same unit type. So we had providers report both their 15-minute units of service and their half-day units of service. What we've had to do for this category of calculation is we've had to say what the relationship between the two codes is. So that half-day unit, which is a 1 to 4 hour unit of service, we had to say how many 15 minutes are equivalent. And this is spelled out specifically in the methodology document that is adopted by reference in the regulation. It says we will utilize a 14 as the 15-minute equivalent. What that means is 3.5 hours. So 3 hours would be, each hour is 4 15-minute units. So 3 hours would be 12, 3.5 hours would be 14. So what we do is we take those 15-minute, we take those half-day units, in this case, a little more than 15,000, multiply it by that factor of 14 to get what the 15-minute equivalent is of those half-day units, which is roughly 219,000. We then add them to the actual 15-minute units for adult daycare of 87,000 to get roughly 306,000 15-minute and 15-minute unit equivalents. That is the denominator of our calculation. In step 6, we then take our provider's costs divided by the units that we just calculated in the prior step to get a proposed rate pre-legislative appropriation of $6.28. That's the 15-minute unit. So now we have to set what the half-day unit is. We use that same 14 factor to multiply the 15-minute rate by the 14 factor to get an $87.95. So these two rates, once you multiply by the units of service, represent us utilizing the entire cost of that 1.9 million of the provider. Just like we did for Chore, we now have to account for the fact that in House Bill 281, the legislature appropriated 10%. So you then see us increasing both of those rates by 10% to arrive at a final proposed rate for the 15-minute adult daycare of $691 and a proposed rate for the half-day unit of $96.74. And those are the rates that you will see in the charts that are adopted by reference. Scrolling back up to page 1, Respite follows a similar calculation to adult daycare in that there is two types of rates. There's a 15-minute rate and there is a full day rate. Just like how we had to do for adult daycare of setting a factor of 14 to be kind of the differential between the rates, the regulations stipulate that it is a 56 factor that we use for respite, which is roughly 14 hours. So that will be the differential you'll see between the rates, but it follows the exact same process. The next category of special calculation we have is services where there's an individual service and a group service. So an example of that is day habilitation as well as supported employment. So I'm going to show you what that looks like for supported employment. So now I've clicked on supported employment and I'm at page 30 of 43. If I again scrolled down to the bottom of page 31, you'll see that chart that shows the providers, their costs for supported employment. Then the third column is their units of service for individual supported employment, where it's provided on a one recipient, one provider basis. And then you'll see the final column is the units of service for the group code, where it's a single rendering provider, but multiple recipients that they're offering the service to. So roughly about $4 million in costs, 231,000 individual units, and 82,000 group units. If I scroll back up to the page, top of page 30, you'll see I start out this calculation just like I started out the other special calculation. We have to get benchmark costs because we're going to do an aggregated stop loss. So you see the state fiscal year 22 rate, the units of service are multiplied together to get benchmark costs. Those benchmark costs are added together to get roughly 3.76 million in costs. We do the plus and minus 5% stop loss. So on the minus 5%, it's roughly 3.57 million. On the plus 5, it's 3.95 million. In step 3, we look at what the provider's costs are. They were 4 million in this case. In step 4, we go and utilize that same three-pronged test, going to see if the provider's costs are below, in between, or above the thresholds we just set. In this case, the $4 million is slightly higher than the plus 5% benchmark. So what we move forward with in step 4 is the plus 5 benchmark cost of 3.95 million. What occurs in step 5 now is we have to take this singular pool of costs and separate it. So we utilize the entire cost and rate setting, but we have to set two different rates with it, an individual rate and a group rate. When you think about service from a cost standpoint, Generally, the largest cost driver of a service is the wage and fringe benefits of the person who is providing the service. So imagine you have a direct service worker who, for example, is making $20 an hour. Let's pretend there's no additional costs related to that, just for ease in explaining this. If you have a service that's delivered on an individual basis, that $20 in cost needs to be covered by the rate. So if it's a 15-minute rate, that $20 is divided by 4 to get a $5 rate when it's provided on an individual basis. However, if that service is provided in a group, that $20 wage for that individual can be billed, the rate can be billed for every single person in that group. So imagine you have a group of 4. Each one of those 4 recipients get to be billed for the service. So in that case, with a group of 4, if you have a rate that is $5, that $5 rate times the 4 units of service that gets billed covers the $20 for the direct service worker. So generally what you will see is a group rate that is substantially less than an individual rate, because that group rate can be billed multiple times and is covering broadly the same wage as an individual basis. Generally, when we see Medicare, what they set for, Medicare rates for group services, it tends to be about 20% of the individual rate. Currently, Alaska regulations or rates for Alaska Medicaid for waiver services, the group rates are 70% of the individual, which is exceptionally high in comparison to Medicare. So part of the process when we were developing the rates was talking about slowly needing to step down that percentage over time, where the group rate would slowly decrease and the corresponding individual rate would increase to make sure the differential is getting at least somewhat closer to what you see more often in other states and in Medicare. So what you see here in step 5 is we hold 2 things. So one, the group rate is proposed to be 60% of the individual rate. And the second thing is that we need to make sure we utilize the entire 3.9 million in costs that were determined in step 4. How that is done is algebraically. So you see in step 5, the portion 1, we basically have an unknown, an individual rate that needs to be calculated, say I, times the units of service from the providers for individual based care, added together with the unknown needing to be solved group rate, say G, multiplied by the group units of service from the target providers, and you need it to equal the known 3.9 million. Then correspondingly, you know the group rate, G, needs to equal 0.6 of the individual rate I. So using algebra, you can take that G equals 0.6 I, substitute it in for the first calculation, and then you solve for the rates. That's what you see in the table here. So you see us listing the target provider units of service. You see the now solved $14.05 for an individual rate and $8.43 for the group rate. And that group rate is 60% of the individual rate. When the target provider costs are multiplied by that now solved rate to get costs, and those costs are added together, they equal that calculated 3.9 costs. And you can see that we have kind of the true up there to make sure everything was allocated. So broadly, setting a cost using setting 2 rates using all the costs, but making sure the differential between the rates is such that the group rate is 60% of the individual. Now that we have the proposed rates pre-legislative appropriation, step 6 is just increasing the rates by 10% to align with the legislative appropriation in House Bill 281. Let's scroll back up to the table of contents. So I walked through supported employment that had an individual and group component. DayHab has the same thing, so you'll see a very similar calculation. A different kind of special calculation is in our family hab and secondly in our in-home hab and supported living. So let me show you what that looks like for family habilitation. So for family habilitation, if I scroll down to page 9 of 43, you will see the costs for family habilitation adult, the costs for family habilitation child, and then the units of service both for adult and child. So there are two different rates. Really the only differential is the age of the recipient. Scrolling back up to the page 8 of 43, what we're trying to accomplish here is basically these are currently two separate rates, and they have two separate cost centers on the cost report. Discussions programmatically when doing these rates talked about, we've had providers provide comment on the disparity between these two rates and how really the age is really the main thing that changes and the costs don't necessarily change. And so what we're doing with this special calculation is we're basically combining the costs and combining the units of service and setting a singular rate that will be the same both for adult and child. So you see that in step 1 where we add the adult costs and the child costs together to get 4.2 million. In step 2, we add the units of service from the table below together to get roughly 23,000 units of service a family have. And then we set a raw rate by dividing the both adult and child costs of 4.26 million by the roughly 23,000 of units of service for both adult and child to get a raw rate of $180.62. We are doing a special calculation, so we need to do an aggregate stop loss. In particular for this code, if you're wanting to make the rates the same, there's more than a 5% differential between the rates right now. So to have them be the same, you have to do a stop loss on an aggregate level. So same as what we walked through before, the state fiscal 22 rates multiplied by the units of service, get benchmark costs, you add the benchmark costs together to get roughly 3.3 million. You do that aggregate stop loss of plus or minus 5%. So you can see the roughly 3.17 million on the bottom end and the 3.5 million on the top end. You then compare the provider's aggregated cost of the 4.2 million and see where it falls. In this case, the 4.2 million is above the 5% benchmark. So we utilize in step 7 to move forward the 3.5 5% benchmark costs. In step 8, we take those benchmark costs of 3.5 million, divide by the units of service of 23,619 to get a final rate pre-legislative appropriation of 148.69. And then in step 9, we increase by 10% to account for the legislative appropriation. I'm going to scroll back up now to the table of contents. So I walked you through the family hab where we had two separate pool of costs and two rates that are set at different rates right now, and we're combining them to set a singular rate for them. A similar special calculation to this is in-home hab and supported living. These services actually right now do have the same rate, but they have two separate pools of costs on the cost report, and they were slated to have two different rates being set depending on the provider's costs. Just like family hab, where there's kind of an adult and child version, in this case, the in-home hab is the under age 17 and the supported living is 18 and older. The decision for this was to, instead of having those rates be calculated separately and potentially have rate disparities like we had with the family hab, to combine them together and set a singular rate. So it goes through the same process as family hab. It's just right now the rates don't have the disparity that the adult and child family hab do. The last one of our special calculations for the target methodology is pre-employment. Pre-employment actually did not have any units of service being utilized, and so what we do under that is we propose to peg that at the supported employment rate, which right now it's currently at the supported employment rate. So those are the target methodologies using provider costs. I'm now going to touch on our modeled methodologies. So these are rates where we build rates from the ground up. So let's start with the care coordination model. So the care coordination, we are first looking at the monthly rate. There are three kind of broad categories of the monthly rates, and you can see them listed currently at the top of page 32. So we have the care coordination ongoing for the 41915C waivers. Then we have the care coordination rate for the ISW waiver. And then we have the monthly rate for Community First Choice for long-term services and supports targeted case management. Currently, those three categories, so the 1915C waiver, the ISW, and the CFC, they each have different rates. The decision through this modeled process was to have all of those rates be the same. So the calculation that I'm going to walk you through at the bottom of page 32 calculates a singular rate that is used for all 4 of the 1915C waivers, the ISW waiver, and the community first choice. So we talked about earlier how wages form the base of costs for services. So what we're doing here in this rate, you'll see a table where we have the model component listed in column 1, the factor utilized in column 2, and then the calculation for what's multiplied or added to what in column 3. So here you see we start with a wage that was determined looking at publicly available sources such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics of $26.72. From the wage, you then add on the fringe benefits, in this case $43.50, to get a direct service cost per hour, so the wages and fringe benefits, of $38.34. Next, you add in an administrative component, in this case 10%, because that is the factor that the federal government, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, will allow for targeted case management. All of our rates ultimately have to be approved by the federal government. They are paying at least half the bills for Medicaid. Medicaid is a joint state and federal program, so it's important that we follow the federal rules and have to get approval rather through state plan processes or waiver processes. When we add in that 10% administrative, you'll see it's a $42.17 per hour cost. If the care coordination service was a 15-minute or hourly cost, you would basically be done by rather using that $42 or dividing by 4. However, this is a monthly service, so you have to then determine how much time in a month, how many hours a care coordinator would spend per client. Clients have varying levels of need. Therefore, it's understandable that the amount of time a care coordinator spends for each client does vary. However, in rate setting, you have to utilize an average and basically set one rate that then could be used for all individuals. And so what you see here, how we arrive at the amount of time a care coordinator uses per hour, is we look at the caseload size utilizing some survey information that Senior and Disability Services had gathered related to caseload size for waivers. Specifically, we removed the bottom 10% and the top 10% to remove outliers and did a weighted average of the middle 80% to arrive at what you see as factor or calculation component I of 27.1 caseload. You have to use that caseload to get to the time spent per month. So what you do in calculation component F is you look and say if someone's working 2,080 hours in a year, you need to find out how much they're working per month by dividing by 12 months in a year to get 173 working hours per month. You then divide it by that caseload of 27.1 to arrive at how much time in hours a care coordinator would spend on average per client per month, which in this case is $6.40 or 6.4 hours. So that 6.4 hours is then multiplied by the cost per hour of $42.17 to arrive at a proposed rate of $269.89. Just like we did for the target providers, we need to account for House Bill 281 increasing the rates by or increasing appropriation by 10% to allow an increase to direct service wages. And so you'll see then the 10% increase to get to a proposed rate of 296.88. Again, that rate would be applying to every monthly care coordination rate, the 41915C waivers, the ISW, and the CFC. Scrolling down to the top of page 34, you'll see where we're looking at calculating what the rate for the application for waiver or community first choice was. The first 5 components are identical to what you saw before because, again, who's providing the service is not changed in this case. It is a care coordinator. So you'll see the same wages, the same fringe benefit, the same administrative component for a total service cost per hour of $42.17. What then needs to be determined is this is just an application rate, meaning that there's no time component to it. So you have to add a time component in the rate setting to get what the rate would be. So the hour component used in the model is 1, which would result in a $42.17 rate that then when increased by 10% would be $46.17. That's where you'll see at the bottom of page 34, there is a note. The American Rescue Plan Act, which was an act of Congress related to during the public health emergency related to COVID, issued a temporary increase in the federal medical assistant percentage, or FMAP. That's the percentage of a Medicaid claim that the federal government pays versus what the state pays. So they increased what they pay by 10%. But with that came the caveat that home and community-based waiver rates must be not less than what they were in April 1 of 2021. So what you'll see here is we compare the calculated rate using the model of 46.17 to what that April 1, 2021 rate was, and it is lower. So because of the American Rescue Act, we cannot move forward with that rate, or we would lose the increased federal matching. So instead, the rate that was in effect July 1, 2022 of $106.59, which is already includes the 10% that the legislature appropriated, that was added in July 1, 2022. That rate will be the rate that you will see on the chart moving forward for this particular code. Similarly, if I get to the top of page 35, you'll see we're calculating the rate for the support plan and renewal. Same 5 components to get total cost per hour of $42.17. This time we need to do the amount of time and hours to do the support plan and renewal. In the model, that's modeled as 8 hours for a $337.36 rate. When increased by 10% to account for House Bill 281, that gets to $371.10. Just like we did above, because of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, we compare it to the rate in April 1, 2023, and it is below that rate. So instead of actually taking the modeled rate that you see calculated, we move forward with the rate from July 1, 2022, which does include the 10% legislative appropriation of $454.06. So that is the model calculation for all 3 of the care coordination services. I'm going to scroll back up and get to the other models. We have a transportation model. I'm going to click on that, and that will bring me to the top of page 43. It's very similar to the care coordination model. So you'll see a wage of who's providing the service, a fringe benefit, multiplied together to get a direct service cost per hour of $18.34, multiplied by an administrative component, in this case 11.5, to get a total service cost per hour of $20.45. The unit of service for transportation is a trip, and specifically a trip of 0 to 20 miles. And so some trips can be smaller than 20 miles, and some can be right at the 20 mile to get this particular code. So in rate setting, you have to utilize averages to set rates. So we have to determine how much time is occurring for a trip to take that total cost per hour and arrive at a per trip rate. So in this case, you'll see we modeled a 15-mile trip as the average, and that 15-mile trip takes on average 23.9 minutes. So you'll see we use that 23.9 minutes, get what percentage of an hour that is, close to 40%, multiply that percentage of an hour by the total cost per hour to get an $8.14 to get kind of the wage and fringe benefit and administrative component cost of that trip. And then transportation also utilizes, cars and miles and gas. And so we have a separate component where we calculate the vehicular cost component by using the IRS standard mileage rate of 0.625 multiplied by those 15 miles to get a mileage cost of the trip of $9.38. Then the service cost of $8.14 and the mileage cost of $9.38 are added together to get a proposed rate for a trip of 0 to 20 miles of $17.52. There is an additional transportation rate that is greater than 20 miles. Currently in regulations, the greater than 20-mile trip is double the 0 to 20-mile trip, and that doubling is maintained. So what you'll see at the bottom of page 43, I did forget the 10% legislative House Bill 281 costs appropriation is added in, so that $17.52 rate on a 0 to 20 mile trip is increased to $19.27. And then for the greater than 20 mile trip, that two differential is maintained for a $38.54 rate. Scrolling back up to the top of the table of contents, our last modeled rate is a residential supported living service. I'm going to click on that rate. It is a very involved calculation here, so I'm not going to walk you through each of the components, and instead I'm going to broadly talk about what is occurring and why it's occurring. So what is occurring first is we're looking at trying to set residential supported living by looking at Anchorage-based nursing homes, which are the institutionalized service, and seeing what percent of the costs that occur within a nursing home can be reimbursed by Medicaid for residential supported living. An important thing to know is currently the RSL rates, there are varying rates depending on your bed size. A 0 to 5 bed size, a 6 to 16, and a 17 plus. This modeled methodology does away with that. No longer does it matter through this regulation, once enacted, what the bed size of your facility is. There will be a singular rate for RSL services. That singular rate is set by looking at a percentage of the Anchorage nursing home rates. Anchorage nursing homes, they submit, or all nursing homes, they have to submit to the federal government and to the state very complicated Medicare cost reports that are 100-page documents detailing their costs that tie to their audited financial information. We utilize those Medicare cost reports and go and look at various cost centers. There's different pools of costs on their cost report. So for example, they have some administrative costs, they have their nursing, they have their dietary, they have physical therapy, they might have drug costs. And so we look at those costs and we identify which ones can be reimbursed by Medicaid waiver. So for example, things like drug costs and physical therapy and stuff like that aren't done within the RSL rate like they are for nursing homes. So those have to be carved out or not included when we're adding up costs to get the percentage. In addition, specifically, the federal government for waiver services will not allow for non-institutional services, which is residential supported living. They will not allow room and board to be included in the rate calculation, or basically the federal government will not pay their at least 50% share of the service. So what that means is costs like the building costs, the utility costs, the maintenance costs, the food costs cannot be included in the residential supported living. CMS has really been cracking down on this and has been issuing really big fines to states if they attempt to utilize costs that they're not allowed to. So you'll see those type of costs are carved out from determining what percentage of the costs. So broadly, that's what's occurring. If I scroll down throughout the models, you see it's very technical where we're looking at various cost centers for the 2 Anchorage-based nursing homes, what's being included and what's not. Ultimately, in Part P, you'll see we look at the allowable costs, which are calculated in all the parts A through O above, looking at the wage costs, the fringe benefit costs, and the administrative costs that are allowed. Roughly 43% of costs are allowed for the RSL percentage using this model. So what then occurs is we calculate a weighted average nursing home rate, which is $681.17. Multiply it by that allowable RSL percentage that we calculated of 43 to get 293. Then just like all the other services, we have to apply the stop loss component. Here, the stop loss is done on an aggregated level. So you can see in Part T, we look at the units of service for each of the different current bed size services, calculate a weight that adds up to 100, look at the rates, which there are different rates currently, but remember this model is proposing to set a singular rate, and then calculates what the weighted average rate calculation is of 161.86. Calculate what the plus and minus 5% benchmark is. Again, this is the stop loss component that we mentioned in the target methodology earlier. So you'll see the 153.77 and the 169.96. Then we compare that raw rate calculated to those thresholds, and the raw rate is above the 5%. So we move forward with the 105% benchmark of 169.96. And then ultimately we increase it by the 10% legislative appropriation to arrive at a proposed rate of 186.96 for RSL services. So scrolling up to the top of the document, that is really the document. The document walks through the target methodology rate setting costs for the various services and the modeled methodology for the 4 services that utilize those models. This document is, again, not adopted by reference, but it's included as part of the public notice for informational purposes so providers can see how the rate is calculated. And you providers will be able to, and stakeholders will be able to provide public comment related to this regulation that the department can take into consideration as we move forward through this process. That is the conclusion of our presentation today, and we thank you for listening to our presentation.
Thank you, Kate. Goodbye.